making climate commitments, which we often hear in the news and so on, but people struggle to know how it will impact them directly, meeting those targets will require very ambitious policies. Policies that, in a way, fundamentally change how we live and the decisions we make and so on. And for these policies to succeed, I do think we need people to understand what they are and support them, and then also people with the right skills to actually implement them. And in both of these, I do see an important role for education. So, for instance, I think so far, a lot of the attention has gone into what are the emission reductions that are needed to meet a specific climate target and what policies can be implemented to actually reach that target. But who will support those policies and who will implement those policies? I think those questions are much more relevant for the day-to-day individual, and yet those are not often asked. And therefore, we do see a lot of slow progress, I guess, in a lot of the climate agenda. And I think it's because we're speaking in very large-scale efforts without forgetting that the people will ultimately be the ones having to support them and implement them. So when we think about the role of education, it's really about using education for building awareness about climate change and the role that each of us has in helping those efforts to mitigate but then also to adapt to climate change, but then also in building the skills that are needed to actually see those policies, those energy transitions, those changes in the way we drive and so on, actually materialize into effective changes that will have an impact on the environment. So we really need both. We need to build awareness and make sure that people support those policies, but then also build the skills that are needed to enable that change that we all want to see in the world, having a strong understanding of why that change is needed. And education can help on both of those fronts. In a way, today, we're not really sure how much education a child is going to get in any given year, because we have climate change making extreme weather events like heat waves, floods, storms much more frequent and devastating for developing countries and for developed countries as well. If this year is anything like the previous three, we're likely to see millions of schools around the world closing down because there is a heat wave happening or there is a storm that impacted the school. Just last year, we were working on this report where we were trying to estimate how frequently those school closures were happening. And in the 3 months leading up to that report, we saw Bangladesh and Philippines closing down all of their schools because of a heat wave. We saw in Kenya floods forced school closures, also impacting 2 million students. We saw in South Sudan also schools closing because of a heat wave. So in just 3 months, over 42 million children saw their education disrupted. And it's not just those examples. Even this year, 2025, we're in the second month of the year, but we already saw schools closing down because of wildfires in different parts of the US, because of storms in different parts of the US. So this will continue to happen. And even when the schools stay open, we see that high temperatures that continue to increase make learning more difficult for children. It's harder to concentrate, it's harder to focus, and therefore that has an impact on how much learning happens inside of a classroom. And that impacts everyone who has children, everyone who has kids in their community, and so on. From the World Bank side, we estimated that between January 2022 and June 2024, so just 2.5 years, over 400 million children were impacted by school closures. And a greater number was impacted by the rising temperatures that are happening all over the world. So very concrete direct impacts that are reaching every corner of the world. And these are just the direct impacts. Then we also know that climate change has an impact on students' health, on their nutrition, on the economic stability of their families, even the safety of their communities. So that's why it's so personal, because at the end of the day, what we're saying is that the education, the tool that we see as the most powerful for fighting poverty all over the world, is severely threatened by climate change. And this is something that deserves a lot of attention, and it's something that we can act on. There are ways that we can implement protections to make sure that the children are not losing as much learning and as many days of school being lost and so forth. So a lot we can do definitely for protecting education on this front. the world, young people are feeling anxious, they're feeling angry because they perceive not enough is being done to solve the climate crisis, which is the crisis that will impact them the most. They're the ones who are going to have to live in a world that sees more frequent extreme weather events and so forth. When we talk to thousands of students all over the world, what we found is that nearly 80% of youth in 8 low and middle income countries believe that their countries face a climate emergency. This percentage was even higher when it came to Bangladesh, India, Kazakhstan, which are countries that are facing even more extreme weather events and more school disruptions and so on. So it's becoming a form of stress that it's not easy to avoid. We're even trying to coin terms like solastalgia. I think it's how you say it in Spanish, but I think it's the same in English, which refers to this sort of stress caused by climate change. It's the feeling of being homesick when you're not leaving your home, when it's the environment that is changing. And I think that's quite powerful because that anxiety has the potential of turning into anger and frustration. And we see that youth are starting to see climate as a social justice issue, not just across countries or between countries, but also between generations. And this friction happens at home too. When we were talking to different students in Mozambique, we met this girl who, when we interviewed her, was telling us that her mother would often say that cyclones were like this great snake that blows as it passes and it causes destruction. So it was with the student, with this young girl, for her to correct the mother and tell her, no, this is actually part of climate change. And there are things we need to do to make sure that doesn't continue to happen because it's disrupting my education. So we see this friction between generations that I think youth have this very present in their day-to-day life. And that only brings the reality that they want to act, and but they often lack the tools to do so. In Bangladesh, nearly 90% of students said that they wanted to do something about climate change, but only 32% of them were able to answer basic questions about it. So this points to the need to actually use education and leverage education as an important tool to make sure that those youth and children are empowered for them to be part of the conversation, not just invite them to different conferences and so on, but to make sure that they have the tools and the say to guide the direction of our planet, of their planet, the one that they will have to live on. So it goes back to some of the things that I've mentioned. I think education is a powerful tool. I've talked about how it can be used for raising awareness. It's the most powerful predictor of climate change awareness. We demonstrated in some of our research that for each additional year of school, climate change awareness goes up by 9%. And we know that this is not just something that you see in the future. Even when students are educated on climate change, we see changes in their environment, in their families, and so on. So it's very powerful. There are things that we can do definitely for using education for that mitigation effort. But as a first step, I think if we want to see those benefits, if we want to see the return on the efforts of climate change or the return on economic terms, I mean, we do know that each year of schooling increases salaries or incomes by 10% based on widely cited research and so on. If we want to see those positive impacts, we first have to protect education because of what I said. There are many different climate shocks that are disrupting schooling. Even when the schools are open, the learning is compromised because of high temperatures. So in the recent report that we published, we were able to show how for less than $19 per child, a one-time investment, there was a lot that countries could do to actually protect their learning, ensure that they were able, by they, I mean the students, that the students were able to continue learning despite the school disruptions, that the infrastructure was protected against floods and extreme temperatures, that teachers were trained on how to respond to extreme weather events. So as a first step, I think protecting education is something that is critical if we want to see those positive impacts. But then there is actually using education as a tool for climate action. And there, integrating climate education into existing curriculum without necessarily overloading it is critical because, again, that can help increase climate awareness among children and youth and their families. And there are ways um, that can be used to make sure that it doesn't overload the curriculum. For instance, it might be about how teachers can use examples about the environment when they're teaching how to read, or numerical examples of how to calculate different aspects using climate examples and so on. It's about integrating climate concepts into existing curriculum without having to add an additional subject and so on. But this will make the schooling experience much more relevant for the students. I think at the end of the day, if there is something happening in your community and you want to understand it, being able to have a space in the school to actually discuss it and so on, as you learn about other things and other basic skills, is critical. And this can ensure that we build that support for climate policies, those climate policies that governments all over the world are trying to implement. At the same time, if we want to see those policies implemented, countries have to think about the skills that will be needed. And this is something that needs to be put front and center of our agenda. I think every country wants jobs, every country or most countries want to reduce their emissions. I think education can build that bridge between all of those important themes, making sure that youth understand the opportunities for a green economy and that those are not exclusively for people with master's degrees or PhDs, that anyone, regardless of what level of education they have, can be part of a green occupation. And this is something that we also show in some of our research. So countries investing on how to skill their population to ensure that they can meet those climate targets that they're setting up, I think is critical. And then, I mean, we will start to see how this has an impact on the communities by, I mean, creating jobs, but also building awareness about climate change outside of the students, making sure that those students are sharing that information with their parents, with their community members, building movements that will take us to a world that is greener and safer for these children and youth. And I do have to mention that for any of this to happen, a critical first step is to invest more in education. I do think that particularly in low-income countries and some of the lower middle-income countries, investments in education are quite low. And therefore, there is a need for all of us, and that includes multilaterals, to direct more resources to ensure that education is well-funded, so that we can see the positive effects that I've been describing in terms of climate, but then also in the economic returns, but ultimately making sure that children have access and have their right to education and right to a greener future realized.